the story of David and Bathsheba. It's not a love story, it's a story of power misused, trust betrayed, and consequences that ripple outward. Rather than reading the full chapter, here is a paraphrase that tells the heart of the story. This is a paraphrase of 2 Samuel chapter 11. It was spring, the season when kings normally led their armies into battle, but David, Israel's king, stayed behind in Jerusalem. One evening, David rose from his bed and walked on his roof of the palace. From there, he saw a woman bathing. She was beautiful, and her name was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's most loyal soldiers. David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him. As king, he had all the power, and she had no way to refuse. David slept with her, and she became pregnant. When Bathsheba sent word of the pregnancy, David panicked. He tried to cover it up by summoning Uriah home from the battlefield. David hoped Uriah would go home to his wife, but Uriah refused. He said, "How could I enjoy food, drink, and my wife's embrace while my comrades sleep in tents and risk their lives on the battlefield?" David tried again, this time getting Uriah drunk, but still Uriah would not go home. Finally, David sent Uriah back to war with a sealed message in his hand. That message contained Uriah's death order. He was to be placed on the front lines while the fighting was fiercest, and then abandoned so he would be killed. And that's exactly what happened. Uriah fell in battle, carrying the message that betrayed him. When Bathsheba finished mourning her husband, David took her into his house as his wife, and she bore him a son. But the Lord saw everything David had done, and it was displeasing in God's sight.
Good morning again, friends. So we are in the fourth week of a 5-week series. And so the series is titled The Rest of the Story, but it's kind of focusing on some, what I called Sunday school horror stories. I told you week 1, I picked these specific stories because these were all stories that I heard when I was a kid in the church that I grew up in Sunday school, including the story we're going to talk about today. So each week we've tried to peel back the layers of stories we thought we knew and discover that they're much more unsettling than the Sunday school versions. I hope today's story is not something that you have heard as a child, because it's a doozy. We started with week 1, Noah's Ark. We talked, it wasn't about flooding or a floating zoo. It was about catastrophe and covenant. Then Abraham and Isaac wasn't about blind obedience. It was about whether we could trust God's life-giving character. And Jonah, last week, wasn't just a story about a big fish. It was about a prophet who threw a tantrum when God's mercy was too big, too wide, and too deep. And today we come to David and Bathsheba. Now, if you grew up in the church, you might have heard the story, even in preaching, softened into something like David's great mistake. Or even worse, the story's told like a forbidden romance. But we need to be very clear that this is not a love story. This is a story of abuse, betrayal, and cover-up. This is a story of a powerful man who used his position to take what he wanted, no matter the cost to other people. It's the story of a woman whose voice was silenced. It's the story of a loyal soldier betrayed to his death. And yes, this is the story of David, the same David called a man after God's own heart. He's the abuser here. So too often, that phrase, a man after God's own heart, gets used as a way of excusing David's actions. We just gloss over Bathsheba's pain. And we can't do that, friends. We can't do that because God doesn't do that. So today, let's hear the story for what it is. It's a warning about the misuse of power. It's a witness to God's justice and a glimpse of a mercy that never erases harm, but insists that harm does not get the final word. And to really understand the story, we need to look at David's story. To understand, and we're talking context here, right? Up until this point, David's story is one of triumph. He was the shepherd boy chosen by God. He was the giant slayer, the warrior who became king. And before that, if you remember the stories of David, maybe from other sermons or from Sunday school, you hear about David who killed, or Saul, who was the king then, who killed his hundreds or thousands, and David had done what? Killed tens of thousands. So up until this point, David's life, his reign, could be categorized as one of triumph, of victorious. And by the time we reach 2 Samuel chapter 11, which is where this paraphrased version of the story that Doug read came from, David has everything. David has wealth and power and influence, and he's at the height of his success when the cracks really start showing through. And this story begins in the spring of the year when kings go out to battle. David remained in Jerusalem. I love this as a setup to this story because it tells us right away David is out of place. David is not where he's supposed to be. He should have been out with his soldiers. Instead, he stays behind in comfort, living it up. I don't know, I'm drawn back to those movies from my childhood when I think of the scene with the big palm branches and the servants feeding grapes while the person with the position and the wealth and the power is all splayed out on a lounge chair or something. That's what I'm envisioning. While David's armies are out fighting, David is at home living it up. And from the palace rooftop, David sees Bathsheba bathing. This wasn't an unusual occurrence in these days. The rooftops were places of gathering, it was space you needed to use. So this house happened to have a bathing area on the rooftop, and David spies, I'm going to use that word intentionally because it's a little creeperish vibe here, right? David spies Bathsheba bathing on the roof, and the text identifies her as the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And that detail I don't think is incidental. Bathsheba is part of a household. She's part of a covenant. She's not free. She's in relationship. But David, being the king, sends messengers out, and Bathsheba is brought to David. In the Hebrew, the verbs in this story are chilling. David saw, David sent, David took. Saw, sent, and took, because he could, because he was the king. We should notice that Bathsheba's voice is absent from the story, that she's acted upon, not acting. And that silence is part of the abuse that's happening. And when Bathsheba becomes pregnant, David loses it. He panics. He calls Uriah home from the battlefield, hoping he'll sleep with his wife and cover up the scandal. But this Uriah guy, this Uriah the Hittite, is just too good. He's too loyal. He's too righteous. He refuses the comfort of home while his comrades, his fellow soldiers, are still in the battle. Even when he's drunk, Uriah won't abandon his sense of honor. So David sends him back to war carrying a sealed message, which is, of course we know, his own death order. And the story tells us that Uriah was placed at the front lines and abandoned to die. You can just imagine this battlefield torn up, bodies everywhere. Not that you necessarily have to imagine it. And Uriah is out there leading the charge, and all of a sudden the men just stop and turn around to go the other way, and he's left abandoned to die. So after Bathsheba mourns her husband, David takes her into his household. And to the outside world, the cover-up looks complete. I think maybe even in David's eyes, he's thinking, I have gotten ahead of this thing. He's worried about the optics, and he should be worried about the optics. But the chapter ends with one line that we need to pay attention to. But the thing David had done was displeasing in the sight of the Lord. That word displeasing could be replaced with detestable in the sight of the Lord. And then we get to the next chapter. Because God doesn't, we see in this story, if we keep reading, God doesn't ignore David's actions. God doesn't say, David is my chosen one, so we're just going to let this slide. He didn't excuse David because he's a man after God's own heart. God sends Nathan the prophet, the truth teller, to David's court to confront him. And Nathan doesn't come in swinging accusations. He tells a story. There were two men in a city, one rich and one poor. Sound familiar? The rich man had many flocks and herds. The poor man had only one little lamb, which he loved and cared for like family. One day a guest came to the rich man. Instead of taking one of his own animals, the rich man took the poor man's lamb, killed it, and prepared it for the guest. And the story tells us that David exploded in anger. That man deserves to die. He should pay fourfold for what he's done. And Nathan looks him straight in the eye and he says, you are the man. And in that moment, the cover-up collapses. David's power is pierced by reality. His secret is dragged into the light. The king who thought he could take and take and take is confronted by the God who sees, the God who doesn't excuse abuse, the God who demands accountability. And Nathan names the sin, he names the harm, and David is undone as he admits, I have sinned against the Lord. Some of you grew up, do we have any Veggie Tales, folks? Like, do you remember the story, King George and the Ducky, right? The king is undone when he realizes, maybe it's because he's caught. Maybe it's because he actually recognizes what he's done. We see in this story that God refuses to let exploitation stand. God refuses to let Bathsheba's pain just be erased. And God sends a prophet, a truth teller, to hold the king accountable. We see in this story the truth that when power is misused, it causes devastation. We see that, and God refuses to excuse or ignore it. Justice names the harm, and mercy insists that the harm is not the final word. David had everything. He had status and choice and power, and Bathsheba had none. Uriah had loyalty and integrity, but couldn't defend himself against the king. And yet, in this very moment that David thought he had covered everything up, God still saw. God didn't overlook what happened because David had other good qualities. God holds David accountable. God sends Nathan to expose the hurt that David caused, and God calls David to repentance. If you keep reading in the text, you find out that the child that was born as a result of this abuse dies. And the text would tell you that that's a punishment from God for what David had done. The story isn't about excusing David, friends. It's about revealing God's character. We see in this story a God who sees, a God who names and calls out abuse and refuses to let injustice have the final word. And that's good news. It's hard news because it means we can't look away from how power is still misused today. The story calls out to us in our modern context from the ancient histories of the Hebrew people. And we have to ask the question, how do stories like this, how do these ancient stories make a difference in our own lives, in our communities? Do they? Should they? And if they should, and if they do, then how do we apply that to daily living? I wouldn't have told this story if I didn't think it can be applied to the way we live our lives today. So the first thing we need to do, I think, in applying the truths from this story to our daily living, is we have to name the harm. Now this is a recurring theme through this series. For too long, the church has told this story in ways that minimize or erase Bathsheba, who I went back and forth. As a kid, I was convinced that she was Bathsheba because David saw her taking a bath on the roof. Some scholars will use Bathsheba. It's the same. It doesn't matter which one you use. I like Bathsheba. It makes me giggle a little bit, remembering my 6-year-old understanding of this story. For too long, we've erased and minimized her part, who she is. We have pastors and clergy and teachers calling this David's great mistake, or this is a moral failing, as if this were about temptation or weakness. It's not about either of those things. Some interpretations and some teachers have even shifted the blame onto Bathsheba. I've heard people say, oh, she knew the king would be watching. She was trying to seduce David. Where do you infer that from? Where do you get that from the text? That's not just poor interpretation, that's spiritual gaslighting. She didn't have a choice in this story. She had no agency in this story. She was summoned by the king, and in the ancient world, refusing him was not an option. And David knew that, of course. Her voice was silenced in the text, and too often it's been silenced in our preaching as well. So naming the harm means saying out loud what David did. He abused his power. David was a sexual predator. We can use that language if we want. He violated Bathsheba, and he arranged the death of Uriah. He had someone murdered to cover it up. We see that in the story. It's part of naming the harm. We don't do these stories justice by sanitizing them because they make us a little uncomfortable. Anybody cringe there just momentarily? We don't talk about these things in church. This is in the book. Why don't we talk about these things in church? Naming the harm means saying out loud, saying the hard parts out loud. It also means listening to the Bathshebas in our own world. Those whose voices have been silenced by abuse and by systems of power, by churches that preferred to protect leaders rather than tell the truth. By churches who preferred to protect leaders instead of listening to survivors. And friends, as people of faith, we have to say we believe you. We refuse to look away. We're not going to spiritualize pain away. So we name the harm. We also recognize, and I think we probably all know this, that unchecked power is dangerous. What's that expression? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Or just power corrupts. I've heard it shortened. David's downfall started with this power that was unchecked. There's no accountability. He was the king, answerable to no one. And that isolation created the conditions for abuse. Go back to the beginning of the story. It was in the spring when kings were usually off to war, but David was at home, isolated. So he has absolute power. He gets what he wants when he wants it. And he's isolated from community. He's in this space where nobody's even going to know what he's up to because they're all gone. They're all out fighting his battles in his name. We see these same dynamics play out all around us when leaders in churches and corporations or governments are elevated beyond accountability. We know that abuse festers. When institutions protect reputation instead of the vulnerable, people are harmed. We see this every day when communities decide that certain people are above questioning, they're beyond reproach, that sets the stage for disaster. Unchecked power is toxic. That's why transparency matters. Transparency matters. Accountability matters. We have to resist systems that concentrate power in the hands of a few and silence dissent. That's what's happening, part of the dynamic we see in this story. A story that is a warning that even God's chosen king is capable of terrible abuse when left unchecked. So we recognize that unchecked power is dangerous. We also, friends, we speak truth to power. This is the tough one. Because power is dangerous. We speak truth, though. You see, Bathsheba had no voice in this chapter, but Nathan did. Nathan the prophet, Nathan the truth teller. He stood before the most powerful man in Israel and told him a story that absolutely broke him down. When he said those words, "You are that man." And we need to take note, Nathan's courage didn't erase what happened to Bathsheba or Uriah. That harm was real, that harm was done, but Nathan's truth-telling made it impossible for David to hide behind excuses. Nathan's confrontation opened the door for repentance. And in our world today, we need more Nathans. People willing to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us, even when it risks our own safety. Sometimes that looks like calling out injustice in systems. Sometimes it looks like refusing to stay silent when we see abuse in our own communities. And sometimes it looks like simply naming what others want to deny. Speaking truth to power isn't about shame. It's about creating the possibility of change, accountability, and healing. It's about refusing to let silence protect the abuser. And then fourth, friends, we have to trust that God's mercy is still at work. The story doesn't end in despair. Bathsheba, while in this narrative doesn't have agency and no voice, she's not erased from the biblical narrative. Later, she becomes the mother of Solomon. It's her second child with David. And her voice reemerges as she advocates, some might say scheming, as she advocates for him to succeed David on the throne. And in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's gospel, Bathsheba's name is there. Not hidden, not forgotten. She's one of only 4 women named in that long list, and that matters. Because Bathsheba's story, her survival, her motherhood, her dignity is woven into the lineage of the Messiah. This God of justice not only names the harm, but insists that the one who was silenced will be remembered as part of salvation's story. God's mercy doesn't erase the harm Bathsheba endured. It insists that her story is not defined by the abuse she suffered. She's remembered, she's honored, she's included in the line that leads to Jesus. And here's good news for us, friends. We see in this story, the whole story, that God's mercy can redeem what others meant for destruction. That God's mercy insists that harm is not the final chapter. That God's mercy refuses to let injustice write the ending. This isn't just a story about David and Bathsheba. It's a story about us. How we name harm, how we resist unchecked power, how we speak truth, and how we trust that God's still weaving mercy and redemption, even from the most broken places. The story asks us to recognize that just like David, we are capable of harm when we let power and privilege go unchecked. It asks us to be Nathans, willing to hold power accountable, willing to stand for those without a voice. And it asks us to trust that God is still at work. I'm going to invite the praise team to come back up. And as they're doing that, I would say to you in closing to not let this story, let's not tell this story as romantic or harmless. Let's tell it as it is. A story of sin and sorrow, but also one of justice and grace. Because in the end, the rest of the story is this, that power is abused, but God still heals. That leaders fail, but God still redeems. That sin wounds, but mercy will not let go. That's the good news in this terrible tale. And that's the rest